Hi, everybody. Welcome to the session. My name's Alicia from CLOCKSS, and I'm going to get us started. And then we'll hear from Jason Coleman from the University of Michigan, Gaelle Bequet from the ISSN International Center, and then we have a pre-recorded video from Mikael Laakso from Finland, who's also on Zoom and can hear us, I think. Hi, Mikael. Okay, so there he is. Hey, okay, excellent. So if we could go back to the slides, thank you. You're here in this room, I'm guessing, because you're already interested in and enthusiastic about digital preservation. But if you're not already, we're going to try to convince you by the end of this 40-minute session. So much scholarship is available online in digital formats, and an increasing amount is being born digital and can't even be represented in printed ways. And that's an interesting challenge for librarians and publishers. What it means is that we need to keep up to pace with those technological changes. It also means that we have an opportunity. With our print collections, we've had to retrospectively think about how to preserve them despite being on acid paper or perhaps having been stored in the past in the wrong environmental conditions. With our digital collections, we can think about preservation and inform the way that they're created in the first place to increase their preservability. We can think about our content acquisition practices to help ensure that more of this digital content is professionally archived and preserved. So I'm going to be talking about a project that's been underway this year with a group of librarians and digital preservation people, and now in consultation more broadly with publishers as well. And what we set ourselves the task of doing is thinking about how the license agreements between libraries and publishers are leveraged to ensure the digital preservation of electronic journals, books, and supplementary materials. And the question that librarians might be asking themselves as they negotiate these kinds of license agreements is this: how do I access all this digital content, dear publisher, if you're no longer able to provide access to it? And digital preservation is one of the important answers to that question. So we had a broad working group. I'll flash the names up quite quickly. We're also going to make the slides available to everyone so you can review these names. A really terrific group of people who've met on a monthly basis. And what we started out by doing is gathering together lots of example licenses that are struck between librarians and publishers, and we reviewed the clauses within them. And there were occasional strong examples, but much of the language that we use now was actually designed back in 2008, 2009, and over the last almost 15 years, it's been negotiated by people who were perhaps not so close to the issues. It's become more vague over time. Oftentimes, the responsibility for archiving the content has actually switched from the publisher to the librarian, which is odd because the libraries don't have access to the original content files. It's often unclear about exactly which content that is being licensed is going to be preserved, and whether it's the full time depth of the front files and back files of the content, or just more recent material. Oftentimes, the licenses that are in use at the minute actually limit the terms of access. In some cases, rather than providing immediate access to the preserved content if a publisher goes out of business, they're actually limited to use after the expiry of copyright, which could leave a gap in the scholarly literature of decades, potentially. And sometimes the reuse of those preserved files is limited to whatever uses were permitted under the original terms of the agreement, rather than broadening it out, accepting that the content, when released from an archive, is because the publisher has disappeared from the web, and so should be open access for everyone without limit on reuse. And much of the language used today conflates post-cancellation access with long-term digital preservation and access. And sometimes there are quite administratively burdensome requirements on publishers to notify librarians about how things are archived. As far as we can determine, that's not often implemented, actually, because perhaps it is too challenging to do that kind of notification. As a result, it's often very hard to verify if preservation that has been agreed to during the license negotiations has actually happened. And as we'll hear from later speakers in today's panel, there is some infrastructure for journals, but there's almost no infrastructure available to verify if a book is preserved. Okay, so the group then set ourselves the task of trying to collaborate to come up with some refreshed license language. This is online at the URL before you. We've also come up with a short negotiation guide, which I'll introduce on the next slide, and that's also at an open URL. And we'd be really grateful for more eyes and brains on this. So any comments or suggestions you have would be really helpful to the entire group in helping us refine and finalize this language. We've come up with separate language for long-term preservation and for post-cancellation access. We're trying to make it clear who will do what content is actually being preserved, where and how, and to provide clarity for everyone. And our sense is that this needs to be approached as a shared responsibility. Unlike in print, where libraries would purchase copies and then be solely responsible for the long-term preservation, publishers have an important continuing role to play because they themselves are migrating formats, adding functionality as usage and user behavior changes, and they host the original content in perpetuity with libraries licensing access. The negotiation guide, which is at this URL up in the top right corner, we'd also welcome comments or questions or suggestions about this, includes a wide range of hints and tips. But one particular area that we're really trying to focus in on is how to define trusted archives, trusted by both libraries and publishers to look after licensed content in the long term. So we're thinking about things like relevant certification, demonstrated mandate and funding, demonstrated track record of preserving academic content, not other sorts of stuff, and then clearly, openly, transparently documented agreements, workflows, and processes, and very importantly, a succession plan. So if anything happens to that archive, it goes out of business, there needs to be clarity about what happens to that content, how it continues to be preserved and made accessible. And that is the end of our project. Over to Jason.
Thanks, Alicia. Hi, everybody. I'm Jason Coleman. I'm a librarian at the University of Michigan. I'm Director of Publishing Services at Michigan Publishing, which is our publishing unit of the library. A little bit about us. We have 3 outward-facing publishing programs at Michigan Publishing. There's the University of Michigan Press, Deep Blue, the institutional repository for documents and data, and Publishing Services, which is the unit that I direct. So at Publishing Services, we offer book and journal publishing services to our campus, but we also offer our platform for books, Fulcrum, to other publishers to publish their work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the preservation activity happening on books on Fulcrum right now. So Fulcrum is designed to host and preserve, the usual ebooks that are text and image, but also enhanced ebooks and interactive scholarly works. So basically, we think of those 2 categories as enhanced ebooks being, your standard linear book, but it might have audio or video or a 3D model or a data set embedded in the book. But basically, it could be reproduced in print in one way or another, although you might have to flatten some of that stuff into images with links. Whereas an interactive scholarly work is more multimodal. It may have audio and video and 3D models and data sets and all that cool stuff, but it also might be continuously updated. It might be interactive or non-textual, totally nonlinear. It might have custom media and applications. So it's a much more complex object. Fulcrum supports both. I just want to give one example of each to talk about the way that our preservation policies are implemented for these 2 things. So an example of an enhanced ebook. I say it's not too hard. We've kind of figured this one out. This is a book that's coming out from the University of Michigan Press soon. It's actually a 2-volume set that we're doing in collaboration with our University Museum of Archaeological Anthropology. It's called Archaeological Investigations in a Northern Albanian Province. We call it the PASH Project. So this book is going to be in 2 volumes. And the text itself it's very easy to preserve. We're going to have it in a PDF-A format on Fulcrum. And that's a very well understood standard archival format for PDF. So that's easy. But the challenge is really all the supplemental content that really makes up the core of what makes this book interesting. So there's a dig going on in northern Albania where the team is producing all kinds of high-resolution images of what they're finding. Also lots of GIS data, lots of audio and video recordings of all the activities that are going on at the dig site. And all of that is going to be in Fulcrum as part of the book. So how are we going to preserve all of that? Well, most of the GIS data is going into our data repository, Deep Blue Data. And so the book in Fulcrum will link via DOI to each piece of the data set as it's referenced in the narrative. And the data will be preserved in the data repository according to our library's preservation policy. The high-res images will be treated as resources in Fulcrum, which means, most importantly for this context, that they're going to have individual metadata records. And that includes technical preservation metadata. So in the future, these are all standard formats like JPEG or TIFF or PNG. We'll know how to migrate those to future formats because we'll have all of that metadata. And we'll be following our library's preservation policy again for those materials. So we won't have to act alone. Audiovisual stuff will also being hosted in Fulcrum. And so for the foreseeable future, if you're watching a video linked to this book, you're going to be watching it in the open source Able Player video player that we've implemented as part of the platform. And so we have to constrain the kinds of video and audio that we accept from authors for books like this so that it can play in that software. But constraining those formats to standard formats also means that we can commit to forward migration of that content in the future. So digital preservation becomes much easier. It's the flash video problem, right? We're not taking that kind of content. We're taking things that we know we can commit to transforming in the future. So when MP4 becomes MP5, we know what to do with it. And we can do it at scale across all the books like this on Fulcrum. Also, we're not doing it alone. So CLOCKSS is harvesting our content, and we're also depositing things from Fulcrum, everything in Fulcrum, into AP Trust. And that includes metadata about the data deposits in our data repository. So if something ever happens to the University of Michigan, there'll be another place where all these materials are housed. So I feel pretty good about our plan for preserving these enhanced ebooks. It's really, I think we figured it out. It doesn't keep me up at night at all. What we're still working on and what does make it a little anxious, although I think we're making a lot of progress, is the interactive scholarly work side. So this is the latest example of what we would consider an interactive scholarly work on Fulcrum. We don't publish very many of these, but the few that we do, they're the results of a really intense work from authors and editors and production team and the technology team. It's a huge investment to produce one of these. And the recent example is the Princess de Clèves project from Lever Press, which just came out, I think, within the last 6 to 8 weeks on Fulcrum. So Princess de Clèves is a side-by-side English translation, critical edition of a French novel that was first published in 1678. And it has, you can see interactive maps, data, context-aware dictionary of different characters and places in the novel, annotations, and other interactive features that really required us to completely redevelop our e-reader application in Fulcrum in order to support the representation that the editors of this volume wanted. And it's really important because the goal of this book is to create a really immersive experience for the students who are studying it and to really engage them in the classroom so that they can just have a much richer reading experience. But it's difficult for preservation because it's so custom, right? And it seems like, how could you possibly preserve a book like this that is basically a piece of software? But the good news is, again, that every piece of content underlying the book is in a standard format. It's migratable. So the video and audio are in MP3 and MP4, and we know how to deal with those. All of the images are in standard familiar formats. The maps are done in Leaflet, which is a well-documented open source piece of software. All of the text is in EPUB 3 format, including all of the dictionaries and biographies. So the components of the book are very preservable. It's easy to imagine migrating these files individually to new versions. But what about the reading experience? That's an important thing with a book like this. So this is where we like to talk about our strategy to encode preservation into the EPUB itself, where we can separate the styling of the book from the content. Every interactive feature for Princesse des Clèves is encoded as a different kind of note in the EPUB file, which you can see a little sample of here. I just took a screenshot of the EPUB itself. And they're linked within the file in a way that is defined in the EPUB standards, so that anyone who knows an EPUB would be able to understand what we're doing here. Our e-reader application takes this EPUB file and interprets it and creates what you see when you go to Fulcrum and read the book. But any EPUB reader could read this file. And if in the future Fulcrum were to go away, and so we had to separate the content from the application, all of this would just be basic footnotes, essentially, that could be reconstructed by another e-reader, either just as footnotes or using styling to recreate a richer reading experience. Our plan for books like this is, having developed this for Princesse des Clèves, to use these same encoding techniques and strategies across Fulcrum for interactive scholarly works, so that we can make decisions about preservation of these at scale. Instead of treating them one by one as custom applications, really, we can treat them as content that we know how to migrate. This at least gets us to a preservation baseline, right? We're not losing all of the work we've put into this book. We won't have everything, but we will at least have something. And we like to say that the pedagogy, the argument of the book could degrade gracefully over time if Fulcrum goes away. Not that we think it will, but you never know. The alternative approach to this kind of planned obsolescence for a digital project, to try to preserve the exact reading experience, would be to employ a more complex emulation or web recording approach. And we might also consider that in the future if resources allow, but you never know 10 years from now if that's going to be feasible, because the library may have other priorities. So having established that preservation baseline makes us feel a lot better about the future. So our goal is to first ensure that all of the content is usable in at least a minimal way, indefinitely, and then, using the resources that we have, make targeted efforts at preserving whatever we think is most important about the text in the future. We'll probably make those decisions based on usage and the level of effort that's needed. So these kinds of decisions about interactive scholarly works are probably as complex as the works themselves in some ways, but the key thing to making preservation inevitable for the projects, I think, is planning for preservation from the very beginning and making it part of the DNA of the project. And also, honestly, being willing to accept some trade-offs. To keep the intellectual core of the project available for the long term, we might have to let some features go or manifest in different ways for future readers. And I think that strategy is sustainable for Fulcrum, and I'm hopeful that it'll work out for us. But check back in 10 years and we'll see. Thank you. Gaelle's up next.
Hi everyone, thank you Jason. I was really pleased to see that the Princesse des Clèves, and I would really like to read this version of Princesse des Clèves when it's fully available. Thanks a lot. I'm Gaelle Bequet. I'm the director of the ISSN International Center in Paris, France. I'm really happy to be here today. And so I work very closely with Alicia on a project that I would like to talk to you about called Jasper. But first of all, I'm starting with a quick presentation of Keeper's Registry, which is a free service that we provide at the ISSN International Center. We took it over from the University of Edinburgh in 2019. And Keeper's Registry is actually a global monitor on the archiving arrangements for continuing resources, including e-serials. So we work with a bunch of archiving agencies, and I'll come to that in the next slide. The idea being to have these agencies actually sharing information on the content they preserve. And also having some information on how this content is made accessible for users, and also because we as the ISSN International Center, with our network of 93 national centers, also produce the ISSN database, we can in a way track or identify which journals are at risk of loss within, the ISSN database, and generally as, digital materials that we identify. So as Alicia has said before, the preservation process with print materials was mostly dealt with by libraries, and with the digital content on the rise, there are other organizations involved, and notably working with commercial academic publishers, but more and more also with open access publishers. So who are the keepers as of today? So as you can see here, there are 16 agencies sharing information with the ISSN IC. It's a nice blend of organizations, and we'll have 2 more agencies joining in 2022, the Biblioteca Nacional de España in Spain, and the Leibniz Informationszentrum für Wirtschaft in Germany. So we actually are, in a way, a hub of information. These agencies share information with us. It's based, of course, on the ISSN information that allows us to produce this kind of, let's say, record in the ISSN portal. And I repeat, it's free for everyone to have a look at. As you can see here, this seized journal called Library Review actually is preserved by CLOCKSS. And as you can see, there are different statuses. I don't know whether that's dark enough for you to read, but as you can see, part of the preservation process is in progress for this title for the years 1928 to 2017, and it's preserved for 2014 to 2015. So we have these 2 kinds of levels, let's say, of preservation that are mentioned in Keepers Registry. As of October 2022, there are a bit more than 70,000 titles archived, and of course, this does not mean that there are not more titles archived around the world in specific agencies with national libraries, and this is only the information we get from the participating agencies. And there are approximately 18,000 titles which are kept safe or preserved by 3 or more keepers. Of course, our objective is to have more keepers, more agencies contributing to the service, and our goal for 2024 is to have 20 agencies sharing information with us on what they preserve regarding, of course, digital serials. So, there is also another type. I mean, there are. I've mentioned the titles which are published by commercial publishers, but also we have an issue here, and Mikael Laakso will talk next. Is the great specialist of the disappearance of journals, of open access journals from the web. So. Of course, he is a source of inspiration for us at Jasper. All the Jasper partners really took, great account of his article about the disappearance of OA journals, and so the idea is to for the Keepers Registry, because at the ISSN IC we also have another service called Directory of Open Access Scholarly Resources, is to turn to these resources which are in open access and which are at risk. So this is the reason why, with some partners including CLOCKSS, DOAJ, PKP, Internet Archive, we are committed to actually talk to editors of open access journals and have them participate in our scheme to, in a way, benefit from preservation provided or preservation services provided by these organizations, CLOCKSS, Internet Archive, and PKP to start with. Of course, the increase of open access journals, it can be seen when you look at statistics provided by the Directory of Open Access Journals. In 2003, DOAJ indexed some 500 journals. In 2008, a little more than 3,500. And in 2021, a bit more than 16,000. As you can see, it's a 33-fold increase in the number of titles between 2003 and 2021. So this very significant increase is corroborated by a study published in 2011, which distinguished 3 periods in the OA movement, namely the pioneering years from 1993 to 1999, the innovation years from 2000 to 2004, and the consolidation years from 2005 to 2009. So since the year 2000, the average annual growth rate of open access journals has been 18%, which is, quite significant. This can be contrasted to the reported 3.5% yearly volume increase in journal publishing in general. So as you can see, the open access movement has really, taken momentum after 2000. As you may be aware of, permanent preservation or long-term preservation is the requirement, seeing the lowest compliance among journals, and especially for OA diamond journals, with only 19% of them declaring or stating they have a policy for long-term preservation. This means that a large share of OA diamond journals are actually at risk. So JASPER stands for Journals Are Preserved Forever, and it was born out of a meeting between these archival agencies and DOAJ. And DOAJ really is at the center of the game as the database for OA journals, which has actually established privileged links with OA publishers. And the focus of JASPER is to deal with, in a first, let's say, period or in the first stage, to deal with or to process journals which do not charge APCs. So these are also the journals that are perceived as to have the more fragile economic models. So for the first phase of this initiative, CLOCKSS, Internet Archive, and Public Knowledge Project Private Network actually volunteered to offer archiving solutions to DOAJ journals, and while Keepers Registry joined the project to act as the information hub for these archived journals. So since November 2020, a system for retrieving files deposited by journals with the DOAJ has been built, the idea being to transfer them and as well as the associated documentation to the Internet Archive and CLOCKSS. Public Knowledge Project, as you know, is the producer of the OJS publishing tool, and what they did within the framework of this program was to review their documentation, about OJS, and also get in touch with, the users of the OJS tool to help them, comply with long-term preservation requirements through OJS, which is something which is feasible, maybe a bit complicated, but feasible. So now we are in phase 2 of the project, and we are actually seeking funding. We still, carry on with contacting editors of OA journals. There are already, the prototype was based on, I think, a score of titles. We want to expand that, of course. So DOAJ is considering this activity as really part of the core, its core business. So they will focus on publisher recruitment to join the project. Also include more agencies, and this is something we need to discuss with partner agencies, with Keepers Registry, and to build like a pitch, what do you get for your money if they come to into the project and want to participate in it. What is the ROI? I would say even it's maybe too commercial for this project. And of course, we need to work on systems integration between partners. If we have more partnering agencies, we need to build more pipes to be able to convey the content to the right preservation agencies, or to all preservation agencies, depending on what the editor has chosen. So that's it as far as I'm concerned, and I'm very happy to give the floor to Mikael.
Hello, Charleston. My name is Mikael Laakso, and I'm really sorry I couldn't attend the conference in person, but I've prepared a short video to share some of the insights that we've learned from a project concerning the preservation status of open access books. That's been done together with Alicia Weiss and Ronald Schneider, with funding from CLOCKSS, the Directory of Open Access Books, and OAPEN. So for many of you, this is probably already familiar territory in the sense that open access across different content types, also books, is growing, but the preservation practices are not already as good as they perhaps could be, and preservation as comprehensive as it ideally should be when it comes to facilitating permanent long-term access to content made openly available. And one of the key questions is, of course, who should preserve? We can debate on that, of course, not in this pre-recorded video, but is it the publishers, the libraries, the preservation services, or some other intermediaries perhaps that should jump in and make copies? But one question is, key question is that who should preserve and take action? And overall, the practices are still developing, so this is not at all settled for how the long-term future will be. But the journey for this study that I'm kind of sharing some insights on here has basically three parts. One step was creating a so-called global bookshelf. We wanted to figure out roughly, using open datasets, how many and what open access books are currently openly available on the web. And here we're trying to focus mainly on scholarly open access books, so not fiction, and trying to omit individual chapters and theses as much as possible in the different search queries. The second step was to figure out to what degree this content is covered by established preservation services, to figure out, can we find matches from titles in this global bookshelf to what is registered as holdings among service providers. And the third step was to figure out where the content is currently stored physically on the web by resolving the digital object identifiers for these items, and see how the content is maybe clustered, or what kind of a long tail there might be of service providers, to also get some better insight on maybe how vulnerable the content might be from a technical or organizational standpoint, and also, of course, just map out the landscape as good as possible overall. These might not be familiar to all of you who haven't done bibliometric research, but we've tried to basically collect from as many comprehensive data sources, as many unique books as possible. So the Directory of Open Access Books, WorldCat has a filter for books, open access. OpenAlex, which is a pretty new service, has a function to search for open access and books, and also open access across different types of open access. Cielo Books, the Lens, also a search engine, and the OpenAir Research Graph. So there's a lot of items here, and already from looking at the sources here, I can see not all of them are 100% what we would consider academic books. There are individual chapters included, there are theses included, even though the queries or the sources try to omit them, but this is basically the best we can do with the current filters available. So we could figure out that there's slightly under 400,000 book content types in these repositories that are tagged in some way to be open access. Then the other part was figuring out this preservation share. So there, CLOCKSS, Portico, LOCKSS, and a service called Libro Aberto offer open datasets on the web for the titles they include in their preservation coverage. So through magic or some extensive matching by ISBNs, DOIs, titles, well, any way possible to find reliable matches between these two datasets was kind of the gist of the first step of the study, or the first two steps of the study. But if we just go slightly back and look at where the different unique content comes from, we can see that the different sources, I would say, complemented each other pretty well, so that the overlap is there, but none of the services is really duplicating any other when it comes to providing information about an open access book, or in this case hundreds of thousands of open access books. So just also, as I would say, a nugget of new information concerning this is that while the directory of open access books is the most curated and I would say well managed when it comes to including only books and having really good metadata to support it, the other services provide a lot of other content that could perhaps be also important to consider when dealing with open access books. So the directory of open access books is not complete in that sense. There are also a lot of other content providers. But some of the challenges we observed so far is that, of course, both the concept of a book and the concept of open access are not open for interpretation, but shall we say different service providers identify and classify these in slightly different ways. And that makes this kind of a cross-matching or data aggregation a bit challenging because, yeah, the criteria for inclusion are not equal across these. So some of them include green open access, so copies found in repositories or anywhere on the web, while some don't. And books also, as we could see, or I mentioned that there is a quantity of individual chapters and what looks like theses, even research articles tagged as books in these different services. So there is still work to do in getting better source data just for open access books in general. And then a big struggle was also that these different service providers for these books have different ways of how their data can be accessed, and in some cases it relies on downloading the entire data set and filtering out the wanted rows from there, so loading hundreds of gigabytes of content and trying to filter out what is a fairly small amount is kind of a big challenge for doing this as a quick and fun experiment, and shall we say for something that would be a part of persistent practice. And for better monitoring, I think smaller data sets or APIs that would offer exactly the kind of data we're looking for would be very much wished for. But also when it comes to books compared to, for example, journal articles, is that unique identifiers are a bit different, because not all books are, or it's not a comprehensive amount of books that are automatically given DOIs by the publisher. So in some data sets, the book might have an ISBN, while in another it might have a DOI, or it might have only one of those or multiple ISBNs. And then it becomes challenging to know what's preserved and where the gap in the information might lie. So there is work to do in trying to have more standardized data. For example, preservation service providers do not at least announce DOIs in their data sets, while quite many book publishers still use DOIs. So that could be one area of enhancement to improve the DOI matching. I'm noticing that I only have about a minute left here, so I'll just show you this slide about how the distribution of these web domains looked like for these four major data sources. And here we could see that there is quite heavy clustering at the top, so that quite a lot of content comes from top 20 web domains. But there's also a kind of a slim long tail of thousands of domains providing still like a fourth of the overall content found in a specific service. So you can maybe go back in time if you want to look at this more closely. Like, we can provide the slides because there's a lot to take in here, but just basically that we could find a bit of both, that there are large providers, but there's also a long tail of service providers and quite volatile web domains. And maybe what is the beef of this presentation is this matching. How much of the different content we found among these services could we see was included in some preservation service? And here we could see that for like CLOCKSS and Portico, the percentages were at best around 20-30% for Directory of Open Access Books here, as you can see, and the WorldCat. But then slimming down as we go into the really broad sources like the Lens and OpenAlex, which also include, in my view, not as good quality data. So that of course decreases the percent. But also LOCKSS had about a fifth of content covered from the Directory of Open Access Books. And if we look at the bottom row, we can see an analysis of where content was indexed in at least one service. And there we can see that slightly under half of what's included in the Directory of Open Access Books is currently preserved in one of these four services here, and a third of what's in WorldCat, and around a tenth of what's in the Lens and OpenAlex, and a fourth of OpenAir, and so forth, and under a tenth for CLO. So to wrap up, I think there is a lot to discuss and figure out between stakeholders about how to improve the situation. And one really important thing is, I think, that we need services that would be easy to sign up to and pretty automatic when it comes to maintenance for small and mid-sized content providers. So we're not just designing preservation services for the big publishing houses. I think that's really important, because now we could see from already from the URL or domain analysis that there is not insignificant amount of content that is stored on Dropboxes, Google Drives, web pages that no longer respond, or at least did not respond at the time of querying. So that's a really big concern. And I think those are then most volatile in a sense, because they don't probably have the backing of a large organization that would also provide a bit of a robust web infrastructure. But it would be nice if we could also initiate a discussion with, for example, national libraries to perhaps consider sharing their data out in the open about what holdings they have, and maybe increase practice for also having national libraries share open access content when possible that they have preserved on the web. But that's of course a step to take, but I've heard of interesting initiatives that are moving in this way, that national libraries can and make content that is openly available on the web also available through their own services if licenses provide. But that's something for discussion more than actual facts here. I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we'll have a nice discussion after this. And please get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments even after the conference. We're really keen on learning more about what's happening in this space and having these discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Mikael, and you're with us, I think. Right, we're right up at the end of the session. We have some time, so if you would like to stay on, if you had any questions or comments or suggestions for any of us, we'd be delighted to hear from you. I believe you would need to come up to the microphone to make any such comments or suggestions. And if you need to scoot off to other sessions, we totally understand that as well. Mikael is with us. Mikael, thank you for being with us live and available for questions. I think we've reached the time of the afternoon here where everyone needs a bit of coffee, but it's even later in Finland where Mikael is. It's 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night?
Yep, it's soon bedtime, but it was nice to hear your presentations as well, because I hadn't gotten a good preview of them, so I learned a lot.
Thank you for being so gracious, Mikael. And thank you all for joining us today. Bye-bye.